For those of you who don't know me, I'm Adira Mangalagiri. I'm a lecturer in comparative literature at Queen Mary University of London. And I'm fortunate to be spending my year on sabbatical this year in Shanghai at NYU Shanghai at the Center for Global Asia as the postdoctoral fellow of Global Asia. And I'm particularly excited to be here this year because the Center for Global Asia has a very exciting lineup of speakers this term. So Francesca's talk is the second series in the series of speakers this term. We also have on October 13th, Saskia Schaefer, who's going to talk about the construction of Islam in contemporary Indonesia. And I'm also really excited about sitting down with Romila Thapar, the eminent Indian historian, to discuss her travels to China in 1957. Tansen and I will be in conversation with her on October 20th. So please do register and join us for our subsequent events. You can do so through the link on the screen and also through the QR code. And I'll get to our talk for today in just a couple of minutes, seconds probably. Okay, so as you know, we're gathered here today to welcome and listen to Francesca Orsini. Francesca is a professor emerita of Hindi and South Asian languages and literatures at SOAS. I first encountered Francesca's scholarship as a graduate student, and I quickly learned the very seminal role her work has played in how we understand North Indian literary cultures. She's the author of The Hindi Public Sphere and Print and Pleasure, among several edited volumes and influential articles, most recently on multilingualism and world literature. And so when I moved to London, fresh out of graduate school, I discovered that in addition to being such a giant in the field, Francesca also embodies precisely the kind of scholarly practice that one aspires to. She is at once intellectually rigorous and intellectually generous. She's supportive of junior scholars and welcoming of new voices in the field. And she's genuinely committed to literary inquiry and to always expanding the horizons of what we research and what we teach. And a great example of all of these values is the research project she's recently completed, which was entitled Multilingual Locals and Significant Geographies. The project introduces a much needed fresh perspective to world literature and really reinvigorates the debates of world literature that had become kind of staid and sort of had tended to focus on the Damrosch, Casanova, Marathi trifecta. And Francesca's project, I think, is one of the first significant ways in which the whole conversation around world literature has moved beyond that. And especially given that world literature sometimes has this very bad reputation of just being literature in translation and literature ultimately in English. I think Francesca's focus on multilingualism has been an incredibly important contribution to the field. And so in addition to all of these intellectual contributions, I think another really important achievement of the project has been the online resources that the project developed. These are available on the website of the project that you can find on Francesca's profile page on the SOAS website. So on the project site, there are sample syllabi, translations of new texts, and really recordings of talks and podcasts and just indispensable resources for the teaching of North Indian literature from the Maghreb and the Horn of Africa. And I've certainly found the website to be an indispensable resource for both my research and teaching, so I'd encourage you all to check it out. Francesca's talk today for us is entitled Beyond the Two Shores, Literature, Decolonization, and the Cold War. And she'll sort of discuss the very thorny question of literary activism versus Cold War ideologies. So we're very much looking forward to hearing that. As Francesca is talking, I'd encourage you all to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address all of the questions together at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I hand over the floor, or rather the screen, to you, Francesca.
Thank you very much, Adhira, for the very, very warm and generous generous words. It's wonderful to have scholars like you joining the fight for non-Anglophone literatures, and also, I discover so much. Part of my work, of course, is influenced by my PhD students. I also want to thank my former PhD student, Jia Yan, who's now at Beijing, for sharing and helping me the work, particularly with for what concerns the relationships between India and China. And thank you very much, Tansen and Hauja, for helping with today. So let me start. So my talk today is about about the Cold War, and the way it links to war literature is really through the form of the magazine and the short story. Now, just to situate it a bit, there's been actually a lot of really exciting scholarship on literature and the Cold War. Attention largely has tended to focus on kind of large-scale, high-profile propaganda programs, either of the US or the USSR, or indeed of China, which tends to sort of see then the rest of the world as kind of areas of, on which to exert influence and to try to control. But there's also been other kind of literature that, of scholarship, like Patrick Eber on Latin America, or Monica Popescu on Africa, or indeed the Palgrave Handbook of Cold War Literature, that has been taken what we in our Mulo CGA project call sort of a located approach. So focusing more on local perspectives, local actors, local struggles, local definitions. And this is my chance to plug a book which is going to come out from the project, co-edited by Nilam Srivastava, Letizia Zecchini, and myself, from one of the project conferences on the form of ideology and the ideology of form on sort of print cultures in the Cold War period. And the essays in this volume are also sort of firmly located. So they look at Cold War, the Cold War literature from the perspective of, let's say, Rabat, Delhi, Bombay, Tunis, and so on. And what this located approach allows us to do is to focus on and follow what local editors, writers, literary activists, as we call them, kind of did with that mass of print material that was produced as part of the kind of Cold War propaganda, but also sort of political interest in decolonization, and how they selected, inflected, understood key ideological terms like freedom, peace, modernity, as well as text and authors. So our book, or the essays in our book, have this kind of double vision, or cultivate this double vision of, focus on the large dynamics of the Cold War, but also on sort of local dynamics. And also I think they show, and I will show as I show with my talk today, also a kind of wider range of actors and print formats than the big propaganda the big sort of propaganda program. So of course you have state publishers like in China or the USSR, which invested heavily into translations. You've got foundations, associations, you've got large private publishers like Longmans, Heinemann, and so on, or you've got media groups like Times of India Group, which will be part of the focus of my focus today, and then small or medium private publishers and magazines. So what I'm focusing today is magazines, and again, kind of work on magazines in the Cold War. There's this really exciting book called Campaigning Culture, which is on the magazines of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, so the kind of US funded or CIA, indirectly CIA funded magazines, or work on the magazine in world literature that has tended to focus on the idea of the little magazine, the American, mainly the American idea of the independent, often avant-garde or countercultural, and the idea of the little magazine as a network. And in fact, if you're interested in this, we had a whole series of podcasts on the magazine and world literature. So what I'm presenting today is also part of that. And basically my argument vis-a-vis this kind of context is to say that magazines in this Cold War period, and I focus particularly on Hindi magazines from the 50s to the 70s, cannot really be considered part of a network, but rather what I would call a relay. So they use the materials that are, and they're very curious and very clued in what is published and what circulates through network magazines and publications and so on, but actually do very much their own thing, as we will see. So basically, if you think of the sort of the way in which my talk, wants to sort of talk about, use the magazine to think about world literature in the context of the Cold War, think about literary activism, and because the magazines in Hindi, these are short story magazines, also think about the particular role of the short story within these sort of assemblages and configurations of world literature. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have short story magazines in China, but in India they have been very. I mean, not just the short story has been, a staple of magazine publications, but there have been quite a few magazines just devoted to the short story. And these are my questions. So how do magazines, or even how does the short story do world literature? How does it make world literature and the world visible? And also thinking about, the reader's experience. Is the experience of the world and of world literature that one gets through the magazine different from, other experiences of world literature, whether in, university course, or idea of a canon of great works, an anthology, a book series, and so on. And then, of course, importantly for the Cold War, what is the correlation between political internationalism and literary internationalism? We can think in terms of visibility, do you focus on the countries and the literatures that you are politically affiliated to? But do literary choices really map onto political ones? And my third question is one that has been, sort of thinking about an argument that has been raised by Andrew Rubin and Elizabeth Holt, who, talking about the magazines, particularly the Congress for Cultural Freedom, so the US funded magazines, say that they produced for the first time a global simultaneity of literary time. And looking at my magazines instead, on these Hindi magazines, but also some English Indian ones, I find, I try to engage with that sense. Do they really produce a global simultaneity, or do we see interesting things happening with literary time? Of course, I'm also mindful in this of, Pascal Casanova's sort of argument that has been much criticized of the, Greenwich meridian of literary time. So where, there is one one time space line, which determines the now, and then the furthest you are from it, you know, the more delayed and you are. Okay, so to start with the first question, first question about how do magazines do world literature, I won't really go very much into it, but just to show you that actually, even just looking at Hindi and English magazines of the 50s to 70s, you see quite a range of different possibilities. And I'm encouraging you to think about, you know, if you're interested in magazines or you work in magazines, think about, you know, how do your magazines fit in one of these categories which I've thought out, or, you know, constitute others. So a magazine like Kahani, short story, did world literature really through what I call textual presence. So not really articles, but just translations. In fact, often not really introduced. And most of its translations were from Indian languages, but it always had one foreign story. And I'll talk more about it. Then a kind of middlebrow English magazine called Caravan, which is still going on, more not middlebrow anymore in India now. It started a series of, you know, short stories from around the world, but also world novels condensed, and it kind of employed or did what I would call a random systematicity. So he wanted to be systematic about having something from all over the world, but then what occupied that particular slot, or, you know, say the Arab story or the Chinese story was not, or the Japanese story was not actually often, you know, a representative writer or an interesting writer from that literature. So the Arab story was a German writer, or Japanese story was Lafcadio Hearn, for example. Another magazine or two other magazines, in fact, of this period, one in Hindi, Yug Chetna, Consciousness of the Time, and one English, Quest, rather than textual presence, did world literature through a kind of indirect presence, so through critical articles, sometimes a story, sometimes a poem, but really more articles. And interestingly, the Quest, which was the Congress for Cultural Freedom magazine, would talk about Asian literatures or African literatures through the problem of the intellectual, you know, how to kind of influence the intellectual. But it was also a forum for some of the first poetry or some of the contemporary poets in English, and some translations from Indian languages. Another interesting magazine, Kalpana, a more very literary, artistic magazine, rather than doing its own translations or articles, translated this long, very detailed surveys from the US magazine Books Abroad, which is now World Literature Today. So, and I've been, you know, musing about, you know, I had this very long 10-page articles full of names. And in a way, it's amazing that Hindi readers of the 1950s would have, you know, learn about or be told about, you know, 100 Brazilian writers or 100 of Latin American writers, a lot of Chinese, Israeli, but, you know, partly with the transliteration issue that, you know, these names in Hindi would come out sometimes quite mangled, partly by the fact that, you know, these were names only. I wonder, you know, I'm interested, I think, you know, this showed that there was a substantial literature there, even if it didn't give you a taste for it. And the other example that I'm going to focus on today are the special issue of another kind of really commercial, you could say, story magazine, Sarika, of the Times of India Group, which went for translations, but also these spectacular special issues. Right, let me go on and show you my examples. So Kahani, as I said, it would have, you know, it's interesting, it's remembered as a major Hindi magazine, but actually it was clearly very much invested in translating from Indian languages and creating kind of a sense of Indian literature, contemporary Indian literature, and translated one story. As you know, the brother of the editor suggested, you know, the foreign story was supposed to be from masters of the story, and what we see interestingly is that in fact China, this was a private one-man publisher, and what I often find is that this kind of big investment in translations often do not last very long. So for Kahani, this really lasted for about 4 or 5 years. I mean, it's very impressive, and even if it doesn't last for very long. So what you see, you can see that clearly, although the editor was not necessarily, left affiliated, but his brother was, and I wonder whether he was the one who was suggesting the foreign stories. So what you see is that, the Eastern Bloc, China, in fact, has got most stories than Russia, but only a couple of Soviet contemporary authors, some mostly older ones. The same is true of Eastern European writers, and this is an interesting point for me that I bring away from this, that there's a political orientation that is a contemporary political orientation, but literarily the authors chosen are earlier ones, and that somehow lifts them into in this case the communist present. So Moritz, for example, 1913, is of course pre-communist, but his concern with poverty and humor makes him a kind of contemporary writer. You see there are a few communist or leftist American writers, and the first African story, I think, translated into Hindi. And this, of course, chimes with, if you see what the kind of advertisements that we find in Kahani for Chinese, Russian books and magazines, and the kind of novels that the press translated. My second example instead comes from the 1960s, from this 60s, 70s, from this magazine that instead is part of a definitely not leftist big media group, the Times of India group. And what we see that in the 1960s, the foreign stories are largely European. In fact, Sarika does also world literature, not just in one way, and I think that's kind of true of several magazines. So it will have this kind of film, I think, influenced choice of Italian stories. When it also has a column called "What is the Story? Kahani kya hai?" from the master, Ustadon ki nigah se, from the master's view, and there you have a more kind of canonical, you could say, list of writers. But then, interestingly, you also have another set of articles by Kamleshwar, who becomes later the editor, which are instead much more about, the non-West, the non-Europe, so Egypt, Iran, Indonesian, New Zealand stories. Kamleshwar, the author of these articles, is a sort of prominent story writer in Hindi of the time, of the sort of Nai Kahani, new short story trend of the 1950s and 60s. He in fact worked at Kahani. He moved a lot in his career, then edited a political affairs magazine, which I haven't been able to find. Then he became assistant editor of another short story journal, and then the editor, and then edited Sarika for about 8 years, and then worked in television, dailies, and so on. And he's become though I don't like him very much as a novelist and as a short story writer, he's definitely a hero for me. Now, interestingly, you can see, and so he launches, or he kind of maybe invests even more in this idea of the special issue. As you can see, not necessarily all very political. So you've got war stories, yes, third world, but also, love stories, or the courtesan. So a mixture of politics and non-politics, and non-political, as you can also see from the magazines. But what the kind of the special issue as a form and as a format allows him to do, as opposed to having, one story for every issue, is to really, in a way, represent the world, or, give a vision of the world. And I think if you can see the kind of particularly maybe between these two special issues, now that you already see that, in the special issue of 1964, you've got quite a lot of, Western authors or European authors, but quite a lot of, several, an Egyptian, or, Latin American, Ghanaian, and so on. So the world is already not just, mostly Western Europe, or mostly, whatever your political affiliation is, with a little tokenistic presence of the non-Europe, but very much opening up. And this is even more so in the 1969 special issue, where, you have your Heinrich Böll, you have your Rob Brillet, but really kind of swimming in the sea of non-European stories. I think, if you were to take a world short story issue, if there were some in a European magazine of the time, the picture would be very, very different. Now, let me focus a bit more on these two issues in particular, and on Sarika's literary internationalism. I won't go into everything. I mean, I'd be happy to take more in the Q&A. But if one sees, it's oriented towards the Arab world, which is interesting because it's of a piece with, the non-alignment sort of alliances of Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru in this time, but it's not really linked to earlier, relationships between the Arab world and India, and this true same for of Indonesia, more broadly of the third world, so Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and there's also an interesting issue of neighboring countries. Now, what is interesting, if we think about, these magazines, the special issues in the context of the Cold War, we see that and if we think also in terms of sources, our questions about orientation, temporalities, and sources, what do we see? So we see that in terms of sources, Kamleshwar certainly made use of the wealth, of the richness of print materials that were, produced in this sort of Cold War period, though not necessarily, not necessarily sort of directly, or not necessarily drawing upon sort of block publications. I've been really, intrigued by the fact that, for example, it seems to draw for several of the stories, like B. Traven's Burro Trading, and another one, and Borges and Mazun's, from drawing upon this New York publication that was a bit of a Reader's Digest of the short story. So what is interesting is that, again, in terms of, world literary flows, current models tend to think about, direct flows, or sort of center peripheries. And what I think these magazines show, or certainly Sarika shows, is much more what Isabel Hofmeyr has shown in the context of magazines in the colonial period, like Gandhi's ones, which he calls, a cut and paste, a kind of a relay publication. So where you draw more broadly. Of course, there's no issue of copyright or of paying anybody, or even acknowledging. There's no acknowledgement of sources, but there's also a kind of labor of assembling and curating and putting together. So if you see, you can't really see here, but for example, yes, Short Story International will be mostly Europe and the US, and two stories maybe from outside, the first world, you could say. In Sarika, the ratio is reversed. The second point about orientation is that you can see that here the Latin American stories, and it's true also of the African ones, Sarika publishes stories that within a Cold War context, we would think of belonging to, opposite camps. So, the category, I suppose, of, Latin America or Third World overrides the block, the divisions of blocks. And temporally, like I argued in the case of Kahani, you can see that some of the stories are pretty contemporary. And published just about, around the same time. Some instead are, early, about 30 or 40 years earlier. But again, I think politically they are presented as stories of this decolonizing moment, of this sort of third world decolonizing moment. The same is true of African stories. In fact, I've just discovered that a lot of the stories from the Third World Special Issue of 1973 of a lot of the African stories come from the kind of seminal Modern African Stories collection published by Faber in London in 1964, which again, as Monica Popescu has argued, again, one can think of African literature, and it has been discussed as a kind of, chessboard for Cold War interventions. But if you look at, some of the anthologies or the congresses, even, or the magazines, they tend to publish authors from, both, sort of communist authors as well as of clearly non-communist ones. And to be honest, so I'm still amazed at the amount of writers and stories from Africa, Latin America that are published in Hindi in 1960s and 70s. I think this has been, in a way, quite forgotten. And Hindi, for example, within India is seen as much more a provincial, provincial literary and print culture in comparison to English. Yeah, you can see also, for example, Sarika published another special issue after in honor of an organization of meeting of the Organization of African Unity. My last point really that I want to make about is, however, again, to come back to the idea of location and the kind of the inflection of local activists. Because in fact, and to notice in a sense, one of the disconnects. So, I mean, disconnect is Adhira's wonderful concept. Here is a bit of a sort of ideological or ideological aesthetic disconnect. So again, from a macro perspective or Cold War literature, we tend to think of, peace versus freedom, but also modernism versus realism. So, the US-led magazines sort of proposing, not just the idea of artistic, intellectual, literary freedom, but also modernism as an example or as paradigmatic of that freedom from ideology. And instead, of course, the USSR particularly theorizing socialist realism or realism anyway, and being very suspicious of modernism, very, very broadly and roughly. Now, here, the way in which Kamleshwar not just assembles, the kind of authors and pieces that he assembles, but also how he conceptualizes Third World from a political and aesthetic and literary point is really interesting. Because, if you look at the kind of political definition of Third World, which he does, which he theorizes, is very much a kind of leftist, you could say, very sort of very about, exploitation, colonial exploitation, and commitment. So some of these keywords that immediately jump at you. He even talks already at the, about the sort of the global South already in the. This is the editorial from the earlier issue of the World Short Story issue, where he also talks about, basically, the like the later one about the third world. Here it's about the 3/4 of the population of the world. Again, the difference between developed and underdeveloped or developing, and that the developing countries are the southern half of the world, and so on. And again, if you see that the kind of political economic definition is very much a sort of one of colonization and decolonization. But he entitles his editorial as "Tired of Both Shores." Now, tired of both shores, sorry, maybe, let me turn to that in a moment. His kind of definition of both his choice of authors and his definition of, the southern, the third world and the global South, and the choice of pieces, echoes very much actually that of a much more of a clearly sort of affiliated magazine like Lotus, published by the Bureau of Afro-Asian Writers in Cairo. This fantastic magazine that is published simultaneously in English, French, and Arabic. And in fact, yes, also, that may be also where he got there's a review of modern African studies. There's some of the authors are translated into Sarika, certainly are the same one that appear in Sarika. This is in fact the same piece that is also there in modern African stories and in Sarika. But and in a way the foregrounding, both political and historical, of the writers of Asia and Africa, of the southern part of the world, is very similar between Lotus and Sarika. This idea that it's now the time of, and they are equal footing. This is the time of decolonization, and very similar terms. But what you have in Lotus is a much more clearer and affiliation with the Eastern Bloc, with the Soviet Bloc. So you have a special issue on Lenin. You've got, much more a greater presence of strongly political pieces that you would never find in Sarika. Because, and this is, sorry, to come back to the title of, Tired of Both Shores, echoes directly one of the stories in the magazine, which is The Third Bank of the River, A Terceira Margem do Rio, by João Guimarães Rosa, the Brazilian writer, which is a very philosophical story about a man who abandons his family, goes into a boat, and doesn't go to the other shore. He stays in the middle of the river all his life. And the story is told from the point of view of his son. And he's there and waiting for a kind of, for a realization. It's a story that readers like a lot. And it's a story that for Kamleshwar becomes a kind of an aesthetic credo. So after defining third world, southern, global South in this very decolonial, decolonizing political way, he then moves and says these are superficial and two-dimensional matters. There's a third dimension, extremely delicate and abstract, and very concrete and deep, like the third bank of the river. And this is the common fundamental voice of all the stories, the voice of the fate of living midstream, tired of both shores. And this echoes much more with with the definition of the contemporary or the the modern contemporary situation of individuals in contemporary society that Kamleshwar as a writer and his fellow new short story writers sort of theorized and expressed. So there's an interesting disconnect here, or maybe a sort of a shift between a politically third world leaning and a kind of modernist aesthetics. Another disconnect that I want to just briefly touch upon, and I know because I know that it's something that critics have pointed out, and I think even Adhira herself in one of her pieces, is that again a top-down view of the third world literature, or the non-aligned movement, sort of stresses solidarity and stresses, like these spectacular special issues of Sarika stresses, yes, here are the here we are together, united in the third world. And I was really struck by the fact that already in the early 70s, Sarika published stories by Pramudyananta Thakur or Mokhtar Lubis. I hadn't heard of Pramudyananta Thakur before Benedict Anderson's Imagine Community, for example. But then you've got an interesting, sorry for the bad quality, this is from a letter that is part of the Mute Soliloquy, Pramudyananta Thakur's autobiography, where he says that in fact, his mother and father, but his mother particularly had told him a lot about India, a lot about Gandhi and so on. But then his encounter with India when he travels towards Tashkent for a meeting of the African Asian Writers Association kind of subverts his his memories and subverts his ideas of India. And in fact, it's a very negative one. So he's not impressed with, what he notices is the poverty. He has no contact with writers. He doesn't seem to be particularly impressed with the writers he meets in Tashkent. And he says, by 58, actually it's Indonesia which is teaching India. And if before Indonesia was learning from India, now Indonesia was a much better situation. And yes, India may have had bigger buildings, but that doesn't really, if there are people sleeping on the sidewalks, what use are the big buildings? Okay, let me come towards some conclusions to this particular, to these questions. So we've seen that, as to how do magazines do world literature and make it visible, we've seen that actually there are various strategies, and we can think further about the implications of such strategies. And some of the terms that I suggested when writing about this are visibility, so the really important, what is it that you make visible, which parts of world literature do you make, which both geographically but also literarily, who do you make visible? Do you create a sort of familiar, how do you, is it a thick familiarity or a thin familiarity, but still you create some familiarity, but is it a thick presence, translations, critical introductions and so on, or a thin one, so you just, names, for example, in passing, mentioned in passing. What kind of knowledge do you convey? And also, what is the temporality? So we know that in a lot of, other magazines, for example, of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, they would have Chinese writers, but they would be either non-communist or, early writers, ancient literature. Or else, what is this sort of play of lifting authors who are authors of the past into the kind of political contemporary moment? As to the second question, does political orientation guide literary visibility? I think I think we've seen with Kahani, certainly yes, but not with Sarika, that the situation was more complicated. And the conclusions that I wanted to, I suppose you take away from today was, first of all, appreciate the role of the Cold War in producing all these print materials, all these translations, and making them available. And I think it is really interesting, particularly in the contemporary context. So we can think of the Cold War as an earlier, intensely global moment. And of course, the post-1990 also is a very intense one. But whereas now, the sort of the global Anglophone tends to make other literatures and languages invisible, we see that in the context of the Cold War, there's a great production of translations. And in fact, why we know a lot of these writers and works is because of all this sort of translation effort and sort of political internationalism. So political, I think, again, some of the models of world literature have tended to be very following Pierre Bourdieu's ideas about, the literary sphere, where, he traces a movement from commercial from heteronymous, so governed by non-literary pressures and forces, includes both commercial and political, and then the sort of proper literary, which tends to be, would tend, I think, in this period to be avant-garde or modernist and so on. And what I would say is that, really, although useful and interesting as a paradigm, I think if once we come to a time like the Cold War, you can't dismiss the political. You can't dismiss political interests or political motivations. Either dismiss political literature as propaganda, but also political interest in producing translators, editors, literary activists, world readers interested in literatures out of third world, the decolonizing world. The other point that I made, and that we make in a book, is that rather than think, however, of Cold War as simply a kind of influence of, the East Bloc, the West Bloc, China, and so on third world literatures, it's useful to think in terms of literary activism and the role of local editors, translators, and so on in assembling and curating their own visions of world literature, as we saw with Sarika. Again, as I said, from the top down, it's easy to simply divide literature in Cold War camps. This author was in this camp, that author was in that camp, this magazine was in this camp, that camp. But we've seen that, either rather overarching categories or just this internationalism, they bring together authors and works that we think belong to opposing camps. And the last point is, yes, it may be easy, and I think we see it in some of the literature, very wonderful literature by authors like Vijay Prashad and so on, to sort of build narratives of, third world solidarity, Bandung, and so on. And then I think we find that often when we go to the individual experience, whether the travelogue or, the reading and so on, we find that, personal impressions or prejudices or simply, limitations of knowledge often kind of create very real obstacles. Okay, I think I have finished. So let me get rid of my PowerPoint.
Thanks, Francesca. That was really, really fascinating. Look at these magazines. I'll just say for the attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask the question using your voice, then please raise your hand and we can give you access to be able to address us directly. So as people are processing and mulling over, I wanted to ask you, Francesca, as you know, I've worked a bit on the purposeful mistranslations of Chinese literature in the wake of the war in '62 into Hindi. And so in these texts that you're looking at, what really is the status of the translator or the quality of the translations? And often in these types of journals, especially in the Chinese context, there's the invisible labor of translation. You don't have the translator named. So where does that labor of translation lie in the journals, the magazines you're looking at?
Yes, I think, in the case of the Hindi magazines, this is really the weak link. So, I mean, as you can see, in terms of ambition, in terms of sourcing, in terms of vision, they are very ambitious and very substantial and impressive. But I think, as you know, I mean, translation has not been highly valued or highly paid or really professionalized, certainly not as literary translator profession in certainly in Hindi. So what you find is that there's a great difference between stories that are translated by other writers. So for example, the Gimaraj Rosa story is translated by Dharmveer Bharti, so who's himself a great writer, editor. He for example, very interestingly, he as you know he actually seems to have used translation also as a way of learning about world poetry. I mean, he's a poet, playwright, short story and novel writer. So that translation is very good. I think some of the other translations, I mean, the translators are, they're just a name, and in fact, many of those names, it's not names that I would recognize or would be able to place in, as authors in their own right, or sort of translators who have a profile as translators, and often the translations are okay. In terms of the politics of language of Hindi, as you know, so Hindi is part of this, or let's say Hindi literature, like other languages, draws upon a range of registers, of kinds of language. There's more Urdu, Persianite register. There's a more demotic, sort of dialect near register, the more the colloquial. But throughout the nationalist period, Hindi got more and more identified as a very Sanskritized and sort of high register of Hindi, which has become, unfortunately, the kind of the default language, default code for translation. So, and I think that is true even now. So what you read, when you read these translations, you think, and you read the originals, you see that often the play with register that you have in the original is just not there in Hindi. In Hindi, they just go for a kind of, say, even for colloquial dialogues, for non-colloquial words at all. And so, and I think that has to do with partly the history of Hindi, and partly with the non-professionalization of the translator, which I imagine means that they were not paid much, if they were paid at all. And that also, I think, if I think about Italian, where writers have historically translated a lot, I think writers have not that many writers have been translators, I think, in Hindi, or that's not been a kind of a parallel practice.
There are a couple of questions coming in, but if I can abuse my position as moderator a little bit longer. It's so interesting to think about the Sanskritized Hindi as the register of translation, particularly in this time period and in the hands of these editors, given that the Nayi Kahani was precisely involved with moving away from that kind of register. And like one of the moments that really struck me in your talk was that moment, that really compelling and uncanny moment where the third world collides with this modernist aesthetic, as you were describing it. But in a really perverse way, because it's almost as though once it enters into this modernist idiom, this idea of finding a third way almost becomes depoliticized, which seems very antithetical to thinking about the third way in the context of the Cold War. So yeah, I'd just love to hear you talk more about the intersections or lack of intersections between what was happening, this huge phenomenon of the Nai Kahani on one hand, and then these magazines on the other. You know, did they share readers? Was there transfer?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I almost take it the other way around. I think, I mean, as somebody who's come first to the short story, to the Nai Kahani stories, which are all about, of course, some also social, social issues like joblessness or, sort of educated poverty but also really all about the individual. I mean, the individual as the microcosm, but very much, individual relationships, sort of couples and so on, to see then Kamleshwar as being so politically engaged has been quite a shock, quite surprising, because, it's not something that you find in Nai Kahani writing per se. And in fact, I think within the Hindi literary world of this time, there would be this kind of third way between the more, experimentalists and the progressives, but certainly veering more towards the experimentalists than the progressives. I mean, they are not, they are very much non-progressive, non in the Hindi terms. So they don't write about, political struggle, they don't write about political exploitation, economic exploitation, and so on. They don't use those terms. But that obviously, then to me suggests, I mean, looking at his work in Kahani suggests that, I mean, two things. One, that again, it's probably simplistic then to, divide just literature in these two fields, the socially committed and the sort of literature about individual alienation, as if there can't be, political commitment and modernist aesthetics at the same time, because that's exactly what Kamleshwar is showing. But I think also what he's probably doing is that he is focusing, but it's a bit difficult as an argument to make, because actually the stories that he chooses from Latin America, from Africa, are really all kinds of stories, or in fact, or sometimes it's the presentation, like that Inem story by Pramodya Nantator is really about, a girl kind of marital rape and then goes back, but it's it's actually a gentle story in by Pramodya, but he's the picturization of this man standing over almost the corpse of the girl makes it much more kind of political, I suppose, than the story itself is. So as usual, there are multiple levels of of agency and intervention. But I suppose in general, unlike Lotus perhaps, or maybe that's where he differs a bit from Lotus, third world literature for him seems to be very much literature, complex literature. So literature that is not all about political or economic struggle, that it is about the mediation of the writers and their own aesthetics and their own kind of sensibility and so on. And in fact, it's very interesting, there are articles that he writes on the Egyptian story or the Iranian story or the Indonesian stories, all map those, the development of the story in those traditions onto what the Nai Kahani writers would see as the development of the Nai Kahani. So first a socially engaged like Premchand, and then a more complex and sophisticated like the Nai Kahani. And he really maps the same trajectory on all three. So
That's really interesting. Okay, so let's move on to some of the questions that are coming in. The first one is from Dwayne. And again, if any of you would like to ask the question, please do raise your hand. We have one hand from Tansen. Tansen, is it okay if I get to you later?
Yeah, I'll go last.
Okay.
So I can see Dwayne's question, which is about the relay versus the network.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just read it out for everyone,
Sure,
and then I'll make sure others can see it as well. So Dwayne says, I'm very interested in this analytic metaphor of the relay versus the network. I see what you mean, but I wonder, as a complete non-expert here, whether relays are ever built upon more subterranean networks, such that if we look at the literary magazines, they may seem to act as relays, but can only do so because there are underlying networks of infrastructures of multilateral circulation. If that is the case, does that inflect your analysis, both by demonstrating the bilateralism of the traditional Cold War paradigm is reductive, but also asks us to link the localism of literary cultures with perhaps invisible or invisibilized networks? Here, this is not meant to be critical, but simply to explore perhaps your categories of relay and network, since I find that a very useful distinction and would love to hear more.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, you know, why I choose to talk to think in terms of relay rather than network is, in a way, it seems to me, and you know, the Bulson book on magazines is really, you know, it's a great book, and you know, and it, I would imagine, you know, it's not easy to think about the magazine as a world form, but I think there's been this tendency, you know, whether it's modernism or in this case, you know, the little, you know, the little magazine or the magazine and so on, to think that that, you know, reproducing a piece or reproducing means being part of a network, with the implication, and I suppose my problem is the, you know, is the idea of the implication, that then, you know, those literatures become network, or those magazines become networked. And so part of, again, we go back to world literature, you know, to a single network connected world literature. And it seems to me that although of course you could, you know, at a very generic level, you could say, yes, there is a network of, you know, importation of books or of libraries, of, you know, print distributions that allows this relay. But to me, that network is stronger than that. You know, you are really, you know, if you're a network, you know, your nodes in a, you know, in something that is connected. Whereas I don't think that Sarika is necessarily network with the short story magazine, or, you know, with a Faber publication and modern, you know, modern African stories. I mean, I think it's clued in, definitely, and it's, but I think by talking about relay, I give, you know, I sort of de-emphasize the existence of, you know, a network that connects everything, or that also suggests a bit more of a maybe reciprocity or kind of mutual knowledge. No, I think much more of, you know, these things arrive, they are there, but actually, so if you look at the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF magazines, they are networked. You see that the same pieces or appear, of course they are different, they're not, also not everything appears in all the magazines, but the same pieces appear, the same authors appear, they are part of a network. I see Sarika or Kahani and so on, you know, instead drawing on, collecting, drawing from more magpie-like from here to there, and then reassembling in a kind of more more independent fashion, I suppose.
Shuang has a question, two questions. The first is about whether the Indian state plays a role in any of the literary magazines that you're talking about. And secondly, how do these magazines see their roles in multilingual India? How do they address or represent the other languages?
Thank you. Also very, very good questions. Now, the 1950s is also the time when the India Academy of Letters, the Sahitya Academy, is founded and has its own, publication, its own magazines, and in English and Hindi, and translations across Indian languages. And also the sort of the I can't remember what the office is called. There is also the press division or something like that of India issues a magazine in French, in English, and in Arabic. And what I have found, thanks to a student of mine former student of mine who works on Arabic, is that in fact some of the articles, Arabic articles published in the Arabic magazine of this Indian state, published by the Indian state, were not just quoted by magazines, Arabic magazines in the Middle East, but also either they must have been written in English as well. I mean, some of that percolates into Sarika as well. So there is some connection. But what I think is startling for me is how a magazine like Kahani, in a sense, undertakes this job of, literary diplomacy, you could say, and also kind of nation building in parallel or even before the Sahitya Academy. So I think compared to China, where the state and state publishers and magazines clearly are more central, I think in India, in the case of India, it's more like parallel situation, parallel enterprises, and certainly and I think there must have been I don't know, some of the maybe editors went on state-sponsored trips or things like that, but it's not, these are really not state magazines. They're commercial, or they are democratic, they are readers-oriented private magazines. And I think I talked more about it in another version of this talk, but it's also interesting that this sort of outward-facing role and in translating and visibilizing foreign literatures always seems to go hand in hand with a commitment to making visible, and in fact, in the case of Kahani, translate even much more from other Indian languages. But I think this is very much true of this period of the 1950s, in the sense that even the English magazines of the 1950s, whether it's the Illustrated Weekly of India or Quest, compared to now, where you could say English occupies a much more, occupies much more space. I think at the time, English magazines and so on really see as a, that what is happening in Indian languages is, in a sense, where most of the action is. So they have a lot of translations from contemporary as well as older writing. So I had another slide, where you can see even in Illustrated Weekly of India or Quest, you would have a Marathi literature today, or translations from Bengali, and that is true in English, but also, and again, I think this is not quite recognized as much today, a lot in Hindi as well. No, I mean, I'm really, it's really impressive what Kahani was doing in terms of translating from Indian languages.
That actually brings us very nicely to the next question from Shui about readers. Who were the Indian readers interested in these stories from other parts of the world? And relatedly, maybe I'd love to hear you talk about the kind of Hindi reader, or the kind of Hindi readership that existed at this time, or that was coming up at this time, and perhaps even differences within that readership, especially in relation to who would be reading, or who was the intended reader of the Nai Kahani stories versus these commercial magazines.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, and here I would also point you towards there's one to the work of one of my former PhD students, Akriti Mandvani. One of her, maybe I can type her. No, I'm not sure I can type her name. One of her essays has been published in Modern Asian Studies, and she has done a PhD and will come up with a book on what she calls everyday reading, really on magazine culture and readers in sort of post-independent India 50s and 60s. So she's really looked at, readers' letters, all the kind of interactions between editors and readers. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, misrepresenting her views, again, I didn't stop very much on that slide, but there is a real effort in a lot of these magazines. So why the short story? The short story as a kind of democratic, accessible, the magazine, books are, not that books are expensive, but people don't seem to buy books as much as they buy magazines. And magazines really, I should say, become part of, everyday reading. And so there's a strong emphasis on, democratic, whether in terms of language or in terms of, concerns, or in terms of, even having dialogues with the writers, publishing their addresses. There's a strong tradition in Hindi of readers' letters. I know from my writers' friends that, to this day, readers, write letters to writers. It's a real exchange, and that's something that you really get by writing in Hindi. People really write back, and really it's one could say that kind of the readership in Hindi is at this moment is this making middle class in the making, which is middle class very much in terms of habits and tastes and investment in education, even if economically they would be working class, or there's this I think key category in Hindi, or in India, which is the lower middle class. So the lower middle class is really people who are trying to go to college, trying to to buy magazines and so on, even if they don't have money for as many of the protagonists of the stories, they don't have money for a new pair of shoes, or they don't have money for going out to a cafe or something. So, and the other interesting thing, answering Adhira's question, is that although some of the magazines, so I would put Kalpana there, I would put Agye's magazine there, Pratik, are very consciously literary, very artistic, sophisticated, and so on. And in fact, I think Akriti quotes one of the editorials of Pratik, or something in Pratik, which says, this is not like those magazines, we are very different from those magazines. But magazines are really the mainstay, both in terms of publication, but also in terms of income for the writers. So what you actually find is that, in fact, typically with the Nai Kahani writers, with Mohan Rakesh, with Manu Bhandari, with Kamleshwar, is that you find their stories everywhere. You find their stories in the commercial publishers, in magazines, in the more literary ones, in the very, very, very commercial publishers, the sort of Rasili Kahaniya, Manohar Kahaniya, which otherwise would be kind of thriller, love stories, romance, and then you find them there too. And I suppose part of that has to do with, that's their income, they're trying to make a living as independent writers, but that also creates a kind of more porous, I think. So it's less perhaps, from a certain perspective, again, the magazines can be very polar, you can see them as, oh, this is the leftist, progressive, this is the non, this is the experimentalist, this is the commercial, but then if you start looking at what is published there, it's more, there's a lot of overlap and then some differences. Again, Danvir Bharti, one of the key, most sophisticated editors, writers, poets, and so on, goes and edits Dharmyug, which is a massive weekly magazine, with 100,000 readers, which and more, no other, like some of the other commercial magazines. So I think this, middle class aspiring, culturally aspiring, is very much who the readers are in this period.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said earlier about there being a kind of these magazines opening a kind of middle ground between the progressives and the experimentalists, and perhaps showing a more political engagement of these writers who otherwise were accused of being abstract and writing about lofty ideas. And one of the people issuing such criticism would be Dinkar, who, as you know, I've worked on, and he would have, I was thinking, would this kind of literary engagement have assuaged him a bit? And would he have thought of the modernist new story writers as more political if he had taken this into account? And I think actually, maybe not. Maybe he would have continued to see this as part of a kind of disengagement from the nation, the needs of the nation, the people, and a kind of like feeding into the middle class, growing middle classes, aspirations or desires for being cosmopolitan or having a kind of access to the wider world as a kind of escape from the very real problems that the nation was facing. So I don't know, I feel like this still wouldn't have recovered.
Absolutely. I mean, though again, if you think of some of this, I mean, many of the stories that were published, foreign stories that were published were in fact about, economic exploitation or, well, all the South African, many of the South African one, apartheid and so on, the Alex Leguma one or Kantemba and so on. But it's also true that, I mean, some of the, let's say, ideological fault lines at the time were really strong, weren't they? So I don't know Dinkar's politics as really, and I don't know, certainly not as well as you do, but I can imagine that yes, middle class, however, although they were often middle class themselves, the kind of stories about middle class life or consumption and so on would have struck certain progressive ideologues as being, yes, very apolitical or very reactionary at the time, I think. Yeah.
Mingyan has a small question about translation of Sarika. Does it really mean starling, and does that have a political undertone to it?
No, I think Sarika as a starling as the as the bird, and as you can see also, I mean, most of the Hindi magazines before independence and also around this time seem to have this sort of feminine names, Sudha, Madhuri, Sarika, Kalpana, and in fact often the covers were sort of pretty girls. Seem to be quite different, not of the pretty girls of the Italian magazine variety, which tend to be scantily clad, but anyway, sort of smiling pretty girls' faces, and I've been puzzling around about it, but why is that? I mean, whether it's sort of non-threatening or inviting female readers. I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure.
I think the scholar you were talking about earlier, your former PhD student, sorry, her name is
Akriti Mandhani.
I think Akriti has talked about how these magazines contributed to the making of a new kind of domestic space where the readership had a gender balance in a new kind of way. And yeah, this seems to be part of that kind
inclusive,
of thing.
The family, the idea that they're for the whole family, or that it's not, certainly it's not just about men writing lofty thoughts, but it's about this everyday reading that she talks about. Yeah, she's got this wonderful quote letter from a woman saying that about a different magazine, saying it comes and we immediately you know, my sister-in-law and I start quarreling about who will read it first. And so, you know, this real sense of expectation, and women women not necessarily going out to, you know, the magazine comes home, so you can read, you can, and of course you can access all this world literature and all this, you know, photos in some of the illustrated ones, all the sort of photos about the world from your home.
Tansen has been patiently waiting. Tansen.
Yeah, thank you, Francisca, for this wonderful talk. I had two questions, actually. So one is about decolonization and Cold War. Do you make a distinction among the two, or are they overlapping categories that you see? And if the editors are aware of either decolonization or Cold War, that they are either directly or indirectly addressing by picking the stories. So do these categories actually matter to them, and how would you define these two categories? The second one is, given our interest, Adhira's and mine, on China, after 1962, there's a clear distinction about how China is covered in Bollywood movies, and even some left-leaning magazines, tabloids like Blitz, change their tones about China. Do you see that in these magazines as well? Even I think silence would indicate something, because some of the later table of contents that you are showing did not include China or Chinese stories as perhaps they were in the 1950s.
Yes, no, very much so. I mean, I think in terms of the first one, thank you, Tansen. I mean, maybe I showed it a bit too quickly, but definitely I think you know, those editorials, short editorials by Kamleshwar clearly showed, you know, yes, I mean, a clear awareness, I mean, and use of the terms. I can't remember what exactly he uses for decolonization, but, you know, certainly that we are countries, or this 2/3 of the world have been, you know, were colonized and are now kind of sort of thrown off the shackles type of thing. And he does use the word Tisri Dunya as the name of the title of one of the special issues, where he makes, you know, also this argument. So I think, I mean, I can't say that I found it, you know, broadly yet. And in fact, you know, for me, you know, this whole investment of Sarika, I've yet to find other equivalents. I mean, I think partly just in terms of investment, but also, yeah, I think other special issues, as you've seen, tend to be more like, you know, topical or by, you know, by country. So there'll be, I don't know, Polish short story and so on. But I think in these editorials, both the decolonizing and third world came out very, very strongly. And if you think that this is a magazine published by the Times of India, which has never been a leftist and has been very kind of pro-establishment media group, this is really quite striking, I think. I mean, we would not be surprised to find this kind of words in, you know, Alochna or some of the other magazines. And yes, China after 1962. I mean, I know that Adhira has, you know, made the case about the continued, you know, engagement and certainly reading by Indian writers of Chinese literature. But in my, you know, looking at the magazines, I must say that, you know, whereas as Kahani showed, you know, Chinese literature was their top, you know, Chinese stories were the most published in the 1950s, and basically everybody, I think, was publishing Lu Xun. I have not found Chinese stories in the sort of mainstream magazines after, you know, in the 1960s, and I haven't really gone, apart from Sarika, I haven't been looked at the other ones for 1970s. So that does suggest that an invisibilization of Chinese, or certainly contemporary Chinese literature in Hindi at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's just an agreement that definitely was a very distinct shift in tone after 62. And certainly Chinese translations and the figure of Chinese literature started petering out in Hindi journals, but around 62, few months right after the war, I talk about this in the book, there was a kind of burst of engagement with Chinese literature, but in a very different tone. You can imagine the kind of tone that it had to do with backstabbing and betrayal and that kind of thing. So very different from earlier, but there was a kind of burst of explosion of literary engagements in these journals, which was very different from what happened in India. In China, of course, as soon as the relations started souring, India completely fell out of, CGA or the kinds of journals that were previously publishing Indian translations of Indian texts.
I mean, if I'm not misquoting from Jiayan's PhD thesis, I mean, I think India continued, but it was only ancient India or Tagore, kind of, safe authors. So not even the progressive authors who had been published so extensively.
And you could say that, really not much has changed. It still tends to be ancient, a focus on ancient and Tagore, and maybe a few Bollywood type of narratives.
But I think, in terms of the Indian side, I think, again, it would be interesting to ask him, because he's been looking at, individual authors as well. And of course, it's not as if, there were plenty of, leftist authors or people who had been interested in Chinese literature, who I think continued to be. So there might be, again, an interesting difference between what you see in the pages of the magazines and what individual writers continue to read or find other avenues for.
I think actually Bhisham Sani might be a really interesting figure, because he wasn't in India during the outbreak of the war, the years leading up to it, since he was in the Soviet Union then. And then when he came back, a couple of hints that he continued to be interested.
Well, I can't remember the date of that Vidyasagar Notyal piece on, which sort of riffs off Diary of a Madman. So that, I think that was 1970s. So, I mean, again, Vidyasagar Notyal was sort of communist and so on. I mean, the piece itself is, of course, not, very introverted, but I think that would show a continuous engagement.
All right, we've wrapped up perfectly on time. So I'll just thank Francesca once again for a really lively and fruitful evening here in Shanghai. And thank you all for attending. And please keep your eyes peeled for future Center for Global Asia events. Good night from
Thank you very much, Adhira and Tansen and Haja, and thank you all for your great questions.
Thank you, Francesca.
Bye.